Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Sorry for this short delay. I'm Jan Wiegel, the Director General of the International Development Law Organization, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of IDLO's new strategic plan, which was endorsed earlier today by our Assembly of Parties. The theme of today's event is partnering to advance the rule of law during the most disruptive crisis the world has faced since the Second World War. The pandemic has affected every country and is rewriting aspects of political, social, economic, and legal life at an accelerated pace. It is deepening existing fragilities and inequalities across the board and is leaving the poorest and most vulnerable members of society even further behind. This will be the first year where the aggregated level of human development is set to decline since the Human Development Index started measuring it in 1990. At the same time, this crisis also presents a rare opportunity for change. By shining such an unforgiving light on our lack of preparedness and vulnerability, COVID-19 has made them impossible to ignore. It has revealed in the clearest terms possible that unless we act to tackle the inequality, insecurity, and injustice that are at the core of this fragility, our societies will continue to be vulnerable to shocks and crises, and our common future insecure. The global scale of the crisis has also underlined the need for a renewed spirit of multilateralism, collaboration, and global solidarity. Today, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development represents both humanity's highest aspirations and the best blueprint we have to tackle our common challenges and build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. IDLO believes that the rule of law is critical to this endeavor. Putting justice and the rule of law at the heart of recovery efforts will enable policymakers to act quickly and effectively while respecting and protecting human rights. It will ensure that those in the most vulnerable situations can access essential services and the protection of the law, and it will safeguard hard-won gains on peace and development while laying the foundation for building back better. It is this spirit of turning challenges to opportunities that motivates our new strategic plan. The plan is based on our understanding of the rule of law as both an outcome and an enabler of sustainable development, and aims to promote people-centered justice. We're honored to have an exciting lineup of speakers this afternoon who bring a wealth of experience and expertise on the rule of law, its links to peace, development, and human rights, and its importance in the present context. Let me introduce them quickly. We have His Excellency Munir Akram, Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations in New York and President of the Economic and Social Council. Ms. Bugita Tazla, Deputy Director General for International Cooperation in the Ministry for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation of the Netherlands. His Excellency Ruslanbek Davletov, Minister of Justice of Uzbekistan. Ms. Liliane Adrico, Chief Executive Officer of the Ugandan Women Lawyers Association. The Honorable Ambassador Gamal Mohammed Hassan, Minister of Planning, Investment and Economic Development of Somalia. Mr. Oscar Fernandez Taranco, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support. And Dr. Ghazal Hares, Ombudsperson of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of UNDP, will be joining us soon to deliver closing remarks. Before we start, a couple of quick housekeeping points. The session is being recorded to assist in the preparation of the summary of proceedings. Interpretation is available in French and Spanish on the dedicated channels. It is now my great privilege and an enormous pleasure to present our keynote speaker, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Dr. Tedros, of course, needs no introduction. In addition to all that he has done for his country, including as Minister of Health and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, since 2017, he has served the world as Director General of the World Health Organization, guiding us to find our way through the worst pandemic and acute global crisis in most of our lifetimes. On a personal level, I'm very touched that Dr. Tedros is taking time from his supercharged schedule to be with us today and share some of his thinking on the rule of law as an ally of public health. Dr. Tedros and I go back many years, and I can recount many instances when I have benefited from his wisdom, including his leadership as chair of the governing bodies of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and of UNAIDS. These are only some of the many examples of his exemplary commitment and selfless service to the cause of advancing public health through multilateral cooperation. Dr. Tedros, I give you the floor with thanks from us all.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, my sister. I'm really touched. And thank you so much also for inviting me to this very important event. Of course, it's such a great honor to join you. Excellencies, my sister, Director General Jan Beagle, dear colleagues and friends, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. As you know, in 1948, as the world sought to rebuild from the horrors of the Second World War, two documents came into force that have shaped the health of the world's people for more than 70 years. One was the Declaration of Human Rights. The other was the Constitution of the World Health Organization. Both documents affirm that health is a fundamental human right, not a privilege for those who can afford it. The WHO Constitution provides an important legal definition of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Over time, that founding principle has been concretized in the statute books of an increasing number of nations. Many now have the right to health enshrined in their constitutions, including Italy, where IDLO is based. Others have passed laws on universal health coverage, most recently the Philippines and South Africa. In recent years, many countries have also introduced new legislation and regulations to address the determinants of health. For example, Australia, Canada, France, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Thailand, Uruguay, and more have mandated plain packaging for tobacco products. Singapore has passed a bill that will ban the use of artificial trans fats, a leading contributor to hypertension and heart disease, from its food supply by next year. Countries including Chile, India, Malaysia, and Mexico have introduced or increased taxes on sugary drinks. And there are many other examples. Law also plays an important role internationally, with two treaties on tobacco control and the International Health Regulations, a legally binding instrument that governs global health security and the international response to outbreaks. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented crisis that has shaken the foundations of social, economic, and political stability. It has also been a severe test for the international health regulations. In September, under the provisions of the international health regulations, I established a review committee to evaluate their functioning during the pandemic and to make recommendations on whether amendments are needed to this vital legal tool. The committee will review several areas of the IHR, including the limited and binary mechanism for declaring a public health emergency of international concern. We're also in the early stages of piloting a new mechanism for evaluating national preparedness for health emergencies called the Universal Preparedness and Health Review, which we have modeled on the Universal Periodic Review used by the Human Rights Council. More broadly, the rule of law is essential for health in several ways. First, it supports good governance by establishing formal codes or norms that effectively constrain or mandate certain actions by individuals, institutions, or governments. Here in Switzerland, For example, all residents are obliged to purchase health insurance covering a basic set of services, which is regulated by federal legislation. Second, the rule of law can help to establish clear standards for accountability, transparency, privacy, and sanctions, and to prevent or reduce corruption. And third, the rule of law also enables individuals to access health services, to participate in decision-making, and to prohibit discrimination. But despite all these advantages, there are many examples of health-promoting laws being challenged or undermined. That's why, ultimately, health is a political choice. Strong health laws must be built on a foundation of strong political commitment. In recent years, that political commitment has strengthened. At the United Nations General Assembly last year, world leaders came together to adopt the high-level political declaration on universal health coverage. This is the first time world leaders have converged on the conviction that no one should miss out on health services simply because they are poor. Last year, legislators from many countries at the Interparliamentary Union Congress in Belgrade adopted a resolution on universal health coverage, pledging to leverage the power of parliaments to translate political commitment into the legislation and regulations to make UHC a reality. WHO is continuing to work with the IPU based on the Memorandum of Understanding we signed last year and with parliaments to strengthen their engagement with health issues. We provide technical support for the development of health legislation, informed by the latest scientific evidence and guidance on the appropriate budget allocation to health. And WHO is proud to work with IDLO on strengthening the rule of law, not only for health, but for the full range of development issues. WHO and IDLO have concluded a memorandum of understanding to collaborate on strengthening legal and policy frameworks to prevent, detect, and promptly respond to public health risks and public health emergencies of international concern, including COVID-19. We look forward to working with you more closely to strengthen health laws globally. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of two things. First, that health is not a byproduct of development. It is the essential underpinning of productive, resilient, and stable societies and economies. And second, that for everything that makes us different, we're one humanity. Diseases know no borders. The only way to confront global health threats, from outbreaks of infectious diseases to the slow-moving pandemic of antimicrobial resistance, is with more international cooperation, not less. That's why we have been saying solidarity, solidarity, solidarity throughout the pandemic. But neither of these ideas are new. WHO's founders knew this when they wrote our Constitution 72 years ago. They wrote that health for all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent upon the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. The world has changed beyond recognition in 72 years, but our vision has not. The highest attainable standard of health for everyone, everywhere. And to add to that, all roads should lead to universal health coverage. I thank you. Thank you again, my sister. Thank you for inviting me. And the honor is mine. I'm really honored to join you and look forward to working with you more closely to implement our Memorandum of Understanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Tedros, for highlighting the importance of a rule of law-based response to health. And you have reminded us that health is a political choice and that it's not a byproduct of development, but an underpinning of stable societies and economies. And particularly we echo your heartfelt plea that we are one humanity and we need to be in solidarity at this particular time. And IDLO is committed to continue to work very closely with you in implementation of our Memorandum of Understanding. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now we will be moving to our panel, and we will be looking at the themes in IDLO's strategic plan. As I said a moment ago, that plan is guided by the understanding that people around the world use diverse pathways to seek redress for wrongs and to resolve their disputes. The plan seeks to empower justice seekers and emphasizes that justice systems must be built around a better understanding of people's needs and their human rights. It prioritizes those reforms and innovations that will lead to greater access and inclusion and produce fairer and more satisfactory outcomes for the rights holder. The plan is also anchored in the 2030 Agenda. IDLO views SDG 16 and SDG 5 as a prism through which the rule of law can accelerate progress across the 2030 Agenda. Many SDGs implicitly draw on the principles of inclusivity, equity, and non-discrimination, and require the creation of new regulatory and legal frameworks and institutional capacity for their implementation. Rule of law and access to justice play a role in eradicating poverty and hunger, for example, by assisting agrarian communities in obtaining land, tenure security, enhancing their livelihoods, and leading to increased food security. Access to justice is also critical to public health and to women's empowerment and securing of gender equality and non-discrimination. That is why peaceful, inclusive societies, access to justice, and effective and accountable institutions, the three pillars of Goal 16, are the critical link in the sustainable development chain. That is what makes the 2030 Agenda transformative, and Goal 16 is an integral part of that transformation. We are very grateful that His Excellency Munir Akram, the President of the Economic and Social Council, has joined us today. Ambassador Akram has also served as President of the Security Council and Chair of the G77, among many other titles. He brings a wealth of experience, and he is playing a key role right now as President of ECOSOC, which, as you know, serves as a hub for the exchange of knowledge and mutual learning on the 2030 Agenda. ECOSOC also organizes important platforms for exchanges around sustainable development, including the high-level political forum, where countries present their reports on their progress implementing the 2030 Agenda. The theme for next year's forum will be Sustainable and Resilient Recovery from the COVID-19 Pandemic, and SDG 16 will be one of the 9 goals linked to pandemic recovery being reviewed. I'm very pleased to invite Ambassador Akram to share his thoughts on how COVID-19 has changed our trajectory towards the 2030 Agenda and the significance of SDG 16 in helping to safeguard and accelerate progress towards the agenda. Ambassador Akram, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Director General, dear Jan, distinguished Director General of the WHO, distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to address you today at the opening of the Assembly of the International Development Law Organization, IDLO, in my capacity as President of ECOSOC. IDLO's mandate is unique to promote development through law and laws for development. Today, its work is fully anchored in SDG 16, which aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. The organization's new strategic plan has broadened the scope of its programs by promoting more directly the utilization of relevant laws and regulations to advance development goals at the national and international level. The strategic plan rightly places renewed emphasis on further deepening ILO's partnership with the United Nations, as it has done with WHO, in advancing common goals embodied in the 2030 Agenda. I'm confident that ILO's new Director General, Ms. Jan Beagle, with her vast experience at the United Nations, and with the able help of the permanent observer in New York, my dear friend Patricio Civilli, will steer the organization in a new and dynamic direction. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate my compatriot and colleague, Ambassador Johar Salim of Pakistan, who has been elected as the next president of the IDLO Assembly at this important juncture. Ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 is the most severe health and economic crisis the world has faced in a century. It has profoundly altered economic, social, and political conditions and reversed years of development gains and progress towards the SDGs. The unprecedented health and economic crisis triggered by COVID-19 has fully exposed the inherent inequalities embedded in the global financial and economic system. As usual, the poorest and most vulnerable countries and the poorest among various groups are suffering the most. They do not have the fiscal space to redress the health emergency, revive economic growth, and achieve the SDG targets. Renewed global solidarity and concerted efforts are required to meet these unprecedented challenges. The objectives agreed by the international community in the 2030 Agenda provide a roadmap to overcome the present crisis and to build forward better and to create a just, equitable, and sustainable socio-economic order. Ladies and gentlemen, the rule of law and the justice sector are concrete enablers of the response to and recovery from COVID-19. In this regard, extension of IDLO's work envisaged in the new strategic plan towards issues such as climate justice, technology transfer, licensing of intellectual property, anti-corruption, and supporting developing countries within its mandate to create a more level playing field in trade and investment will enable IDLO to make a distinctive contribution to the global response to COVID-19. Such an approach will also address both the immediate consequences of the pandemic and the underlying conditions that have come to so profoundly aggravate the socioeconomic crisis which the pandemic has unleashed. One area where the IDLO can help is to strengthen domestic and international laws and regulations to prevent the illicit financial flows from developing countries. I am glad to note that IDLO is currently participating actively as an observer in meetings of various subsidiary bodies of the Conference of State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption, including those in preparation of the upcoming special session of the General Assembly against corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, the goals encompassed by SDG 16 are essential to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda, as well as a sustainable recovery from COVID-19. IDLO's contributions will be essential to achieve SDG 16 and recover from COVID-19. I wish you all success in these endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Akram, for joining us today and for those inspiring words, for your support for the organization, and for setting the scene for our discussion this afternoon. We look forward to partnering with ECOSOC to accelerate progress on the 2030 Agenda through the rule of law. Now I'd like to turn to the distinguished panel. Madame Tesla, the Netherlands has has been a prominent advocate for greater political attention and financial support for justice and SDG 16. Why has your country made this a priority? And why do you think governments and donors, balancing many competing demands, should invest in a culture of justice? And I would also welcome your thoughts on people-centered justice, which is a key feature of our strategic plan and an emphasis that IDLO shares with the Netherlands. Why is the people-centered approach to justice important, and how is it linked to progress on peace and sustainable development? You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much, Jan Beagle. It's really good to be here, and it's an absolute pleasure to be part of such a distinguishing panel. And I'm glad that thanks to technology, the IDLO's Assembly of Parties can take place despite the crisis that we're facing today. We are a strong supporter of IDLO, and Jan, we commend you for your new strategic plan and for hosting this meeting. I wish to address, also in responding to your questions, 3 issues today: the current crisis and justice, how to promote people-centered justice in the current context, and where to go from here. So we sit in this assembly today in a totally different context from a year ago. The current health crisis has exacerbated vulnerabilities, highlighted inequalities, and increased repression and pressure on human rights. You mentioned it yourself in your introduction. Those who were far behind risk falling even further behind. And this has given new urgency to the central commitment of the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind. We welcome IDLO's lead role in reminding us all that access to justice is central to economic and social development to a COVID response. Even before the current crisis, we spoke of a justice gap. Now that justice gap is increasing. We can see in several countries how in this drastic economic downturn, questions of injustice are increasing. Issues around layoffs, debt, evictions, and land loss, as well as increases in domestic violence and family disputes. Questions of inheritance are likely to mushroom, as are issues of mental health. The toxic mix of economic downturn and repressive measures may cause more dispute, instability, and violence. So to respond to this crisis, we need to do things differently. And ultimately, as you mentioned as well, to build back better. Focus on people and resilience is key. Localizing development and ownership have become even more important. And as the Netherlands, we strongly believe in a focus on people-centered access to justice. And I'm thrilled that this is so prominent in your strategy. And I would like to share with you a couple of key elements of this people-centered justice that have become even more important now. First, people's justice needs should be central. Needs of men, women, youth, vulnerable populations are all different and require specific attention. For example, the needs of a young man in Tunisia who just lost his job unfairly but cannot afford a lawyer will be very different from a woman in a remote village in Mali who confronts an issue of inheritance but no courts nearby to solve her problem. These needs should be the starting point and then can be decided on how best to address them. Second, solutions don't always have to come from the formal system. First line of service providers can range from paralegals to community-based alternative dispute resolution to online services and support from civil society. In, for example, Somalia, we much welcome IDLO's innovative efforts to bridge the gap between formal institutions and alternative dispute resolution. Thirdly, different services can be combined. Examples include one-stop centers in Rwanda that combine health services and legal aid, or paralegals in Mali that provide legal advice and community-based dispute resolution. These grassroots services are even more important in times of COVID. Fourth, in the current situation, digitalization and innovation have become even more crucial to respond to people's justice needs. For example, in Kenya and Rwanda, a mobile phone app delivers quick legal aid and advice. We welcome IDLO's emphasis on digitalization. And fifth, to make good policies, we need data. This is well known in the health sector and at the level of the WHO, but it is still less accepted and practiced in the justice sector. Data and analysis are crucial for institutions to improve strategies and to make services more responsive. So where to go from here? I would like to mention 2 points. The importance to keeping the momentum and working together on to promote SDG 16.3. As the Netherlands, we've been very proud to co-chair the International Task Force on Justice last year, setting a global agenda on justice. However, this was just the beginning, and we now need to keep that momentum. To stay on the agenda, justice needs a community. So together, we hope to assemble a strong coalition of friends of justice that comes together regularly and finds ways to push the international justice agenda in our own countries, but also globally. Jointly, we can, for example, influence the UN Secretary General's common agenda and make sure that the challenges on justice are central on this agenda. And we look forward to collaborate with the IDLO and its member parties on this. Secondly, the importance of funding for justice. Justice needs more funding. The formal sector, but also people-centered justice initiatives I spoke about. The increased challenges for justice are happening in a context where the need for improved access to justice was already underfunded. Increases of budgets for justice should primarily take place at the national level. However, also increased international assistance is important. I remember being in Niger where only 1% of the national budget was spent on justice as opposed to 20 to 30 on security. Over the last 10 years, aid funding for justice was less than 2% of total aid flows, compared to 13 and 8% for the health and education sectors respectively. Today we've spoken, and I'm concluding, much about justice. I would like to stress that investing in access to justice directly relates to broader development goals. If we invest in justice, we also contribute to reducing inequalities and preventing violence. For every $1 spent on prevention, and justice is a necessity for conflict prevention, we save $16. For this reason, we need to have this conversation with a broader community beyond only this justice sector. This diverse panel is a great opportunity to have this conversation. Let's find concrete ways to reach out beyond our silos and to work on preventing conflict, promoting inclusion and access to justice, and combating inequality all at the same time. This is not just an ambition, it is a necessity in today's world. And I would like to end with the word of Nadia Murad, Yazidi rights activist, when she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. She said, "Let us all unite to fight injustice and oppression. Let us raise our voices together and say, no to violence, yes to peace. No to slavery, yes to freedom. No to racial discrimination, and yes to equality and to human rights for all." Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tisla, and thanks very much to the Netherlands, which is a very strong partner of IDLO and a much appreciated partner. I think you have made many important points. One of them that I take very much to heart is the need to do things differently. And I hope that you will see in our strategic plan a lot of innovation, as well as a lot of integration to get out of the silos, and a lot of inclusion. And I hope too that we will be able to strengthen the Friends of Justice Coalition at all levels. And I hope as well that we will be able to together influence the Secretary General's common agenda as we move towards the future. Thank you so much. I'm turning now to His Excellency, the Minister of Justice of Uzbekistan. The rule of law plays an important role in promoting trade, investment, and economic growth. Clear and effective economic and commercial legal frameworks provide stability and certainty for business, ensuring protection of investment and property, and resolving disputes fairly and expeditiously. Mr. Davletov, You have been spearheading an ambitious legal reform project in Uzbekistan since your appointment as Minister of Justice in 2017. Why is legal reform a priority for Uzbekistan? And what is the role of law in promoting inclusive economic development and tackling corruption? Over to you, Minister.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Jan Beagle, the distinguished guests of this meeting. I'm very delighted to participate at this panel and share my views. Many thanks for your invitation, and I congratulate IDLO and the organizers for holding this very successful and big event. We value our very good relations with the organization, and we appreciate the efforts of IDLO to uphold rule of law globally. And COVID-19 crisis has caused large-scale loss and has generated a major economic and social crisis worldwide, and which touched every aspect of people's lives, and our country is not an exception. This urgent and unprecedented threat of COVID-19 has required immediate action on all levels. You raised very important question about rule of law, and for Uzbekistan, this is an essential part of our reform process, because without the rule of law, Uzbekistan has no future, has no tomorrow, because investment climate, the people's belief in the government, they all matter for us, and it is primary task of any government at this very important period, I think. So if you allow me, I'll just share some information about what we have been doing recently and reforming the justice sector and the regulative and the sector. Of course, over the period, significant work has been done to further democratize and liberalize the judicial system to enhance its role in protecting the rights and interests of citizens. Starting from the first day, we began our fundamental reforms. We clearly understood that without providing real independence to the judicial system, it is impossible to reach full implementation of the principle of rule of law. So in this direction, the separate Supreme Council of Judges was formed, tasked with exclusive functions of selecting judges and protecting their independence. New administrative courts with additional 200 judges were established to hear cases brought by citizens against the government bodies. And judges serving terms have been reviewed, and now judges, they are appointed for first 5-year period and then 10-year period, and then after that, the life appointment. It is notable that this new reform has contributed to improve the real confidence of judges. And the judges started issuing acquittals. Of course, this is a normal practice in everywhere, but it's something new for Uzbekistan's reality. And the results started coming after giving more blood of confidence to justice sector. And almost for the last 2-3 years, almost 2,000 acquittals has been passed by the decisions of the courts, and which was almost non-existent before. And we have invited UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and advocates, Mr. Garcia Sayan, to assess recently introduced reforms. And of course, he was very critical, and he also welcomed our reforms as well. And on the basis of his recommendations, this year, profound organizational and structural changes have been made in the justice sector in order to increase the level of access to justice, improve the quality of court proceedings. Digitalization of judicial sector is now a priority. E-filing of the lawsuits is becoming popular. The publication of court decisions on websites is common, and mediation is becoming attractive. Again, the advocates is another very important sector for justice. As a Minister of Justice, we primarily deal with the advocates, and the procedure for issuing the licenses to advocates was simplified, and the role of Minister of Justice was minimized. The power to revoke the advocate's license was transferred to courts. The right to take disciplinary measures was also abolished. So the Minister of Justice, knowingly, consciously, we got rid of our own on this direction. Of course, we admit the current number of advocates in Uzbekistan is not enough, especially in the countryside areas. So with the cooperation with lawyers community, we're working on the new strategic plan, which is designed to improve attractiveness of the profession of advocates. Free legal assistance to population is something that we're doing at this moment, and it is already giving the results, especially with the support of the government. The NGO was organized with 60 regional branches, and it already is serving 100,000 citizens around the republic, and online and offline in their offices, in 60 regional offices. And 140 more offices are to be opened to give free legal advice to our citizens. I am also proud to announce that recently, for the first time in the history of Uzbekistan, we have been elected a member of the UN Human Rights Council for a 3-year term, and Uzbekistan's voluntary commitments and promises, which was announced in the framework of elections, also outline the country's future human rights responsibilities. Besides that, the National Human Rights Strategy of Uzbekistan and a detailed roadmap for its implementation have been approved, which outlines 78 fundamental measures. And also, I wanted to pinpoint effective governance as a key factor to provide the principle of rule of law, of course. In this regard, we're introducing tools to use better evidence-based decision-making, greater engagement and empowerment of citizens, with closer collaboration with the private and social sector. For instance, a good example of participation of citizens in decision-making process is creation of a mechanism to bring petitions before the parliament. So far, the special portal has received more than 4,000 petitions. 21 of them received enough votes and approved by the parliament. We have also created a special platform for mandatory public discussions of draft regulations. So far, 8,000 of them have been discussed, and most of the drafts are reviewed on the basis of the proposals of the population, and many drafts are refused after public criticism. These measures may sound familiar to many, but in the context of Uzbekistan, they are new, and the public is welcoming such moves. And the great work is being done on cutting the red tape and bureaucracy, because for investment, they don't want bureaucracy in dealing with the government, and we're simplifying the permits and licensing system as well. 70 types of licenses and 35 types of business permits have been canceled. Full digitalization of licensing system is being introduced. And we're using the regulatory guillotine mechanism to get rid of the past old acts from the Soviet times. And recently, the president has canceled his 500 presidential documents, and another 2,000 bylaws and legislative acts are on the waiting list for repeal, which is 10% of the current legal framework of Uzbekistan. And the corruption, again, you mentioned, Ms. Miguel, is one of the really great dangers to our development, and there is a big problem with that in Uzbekistan. And there is a really great political will to combat corruption in Uzbekistan. Of course, there are some results, there are some movements forward, but still we have a long way ahead on this matter. And special National Anti-Corruption Council has been formed. 20% of the members are representatives of civil society institutions, because the civil society is booming in Uzbekistan, the free media and the social media is really becoming a really big force and in having contact with the government agencies. And special anti-corruption agency was also established to implement state anti-corruption policy. Particular attention is paid to the issue of transparency, openness of government institutions as a key factor, eliminate corruption elements. Strategy Digital Uzbekistan 2030 was approved, the main purpose of which is to ensure transparency of government agencies and placement of open data and other information on the internet. The government bodies are actively implementing compliance programs, anti-corruption compliance programs, and the Minister of Justice of Uzbekistan is pioneer, and we recently received the certificate of the International Anti-Bribery Management System Standard, ICO 37001. Dear friends, today when we talk about our efforts to renew our society and strengthen its democratic foundations, we realize that there is a lot of work ahead to be done. We're aware of our problems and that Uzbekistan is facing new challenges to ensure the rule of law. Together with our international partners, and of course in collaboration with IDLO, we will continue our efforts on this long journey. We have clearly set goals of ourselves. We have a clear idea of where we should go, and we will do everything possible on the way to reach it. Ms. Beagle, I wish all the success on your position as the Director General of IDLO, and we're open and ready for more collaboration with the organization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister, for sharing with us some aspects of your very ambitious reform program. I think you have shown how there are multiple actors that need to be involved in this. It's not just the government, but a key role for civil society actors. And also the link between the national and the global level, and the interaction with the Special Rapporteur, and I'm sure you will have also with the Human Rights Council. And clearly, IDLO looks forward to support you in any way that we can. A number of the areas that you're working in are important aspects in our strategic plan, whether it's digitalization of justice services, or whether it's independent judiciaries, whether it's anti-corruption. We're working in many countries in these fields, and think of the comparative advantages that we have is the ability to be able to share best practices among countries and peoples. So thank you so much. I'm turning now to Ms. Lilian Driko, Chief Executive Officer of Ugandan Women Lawyers Association, because IDLO works not only top down, but also from the bottom up to empower justice seekers so that they can engage effectively with those who administer the laws and institutions that affect their daily lives. We promote gender equality by pursuing it as a standalone goal, as well as by mainstreaming it throughout our work. And we place an emphasis on addressing the specific justice challenges faced by women and girls. We have partnered, Ms. Driko, with your organization, FIDA Uganda, to improve access to justice at the community level. What are some of the main barriers that prevent justice seekers, particularly women and girls, from accessing justice? And how does your organization empower them to claim their rights? And how has COVID-19 affected this work? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, distinguished guests. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I'll just briefly say something about FIDA. FIDA Uganda is a 44-year-old organization. It is an association of women lawyers with an established track record of promoting and defending human rights, with a focus on the rights of women and children as its core constituency. IDLO is one of our key institutional donors. Our strategic plan is premised on 3 thematic areas. The first one is on promoting access to justice, promoting gender responsive governance and accountability, and the promotion of economic justice and women empowerment. As a feminist organization, FIDA Uganda uses multiple strategies aimed at advancing law and policy reform for the protection of women, including advocacy, ordinary court litigation, strategic and/or public interest litigation, as well as various forms of public engagement, including legal awareness, legal education, and community dialogues. We have, through our work, contributed to both the national and international development agendas, including SDG 1 on ending poverty through our economic justice program work, SDG 5 on promotion of gender equality that cuts across all of our programs, SDG 8 that speaks to promotion of decent work and economic growth through our interventions in the horticultural sector, and SDG 16 that speaks to our peace, justice, and inclusive societies. The principle of leaving no one behind is definitely one that FIDA subscribes to as an organization. So I'm speaking about the barriers as we have been asked to share. Our compounded experience through the years has shown that the key barriers to accessing justice are physical, social, and economic. While these barriers affect both vulnerable women and men, they do affect women differently because of the different layers of vulnerability that women experience. The elements of access to justice and an enabling legal environment must be both present for access to justice to become a lived reality for the women that we serve. We take into account women's active participation, agency, and empowerment in the overall process and their specific needs for immediate protection orders. The specific key barriers that we have experienced as a legal aid service provider are a lack of an enabling legal environment, coupled with a male domination of the lawmaking processes, the lack of adequate response mechanisms, lack of state-owned GBV shelters, poverty, the high cost of litigation, and the entire court process costs that are attached to the work that we do, the lack of proximity to the physical courts, systemic and structural barriers. The judiciary is clearly overworked and overwhelmed with a case backlog, as well as the deep-rooted patriarchy and harmful cultural practices that inhibit our clients' agency and their ability to seek justice. The gender digital divide that is both a cost and a literacy issue is also a key barrier to access to justice. So we've applied a few methodologies in empowering the young women and girls to ensure that they have a voice and they can speak to their issues. We've created public accountability forums that brings together the justice seekers as well as the duty bearers, where the clients are able to seek for accountability for the duty bearers. We have also provided spaces for male champions to speak to gender equality and its manifestations to enable its broader understanding and meaning at community level. We have also encouraged client-led advocacy, where we get clients to speak to issues that affect them at the forefront of lobbying for the transitional justice policy and the legal aid bill were the LRA survivors of the war. And they were the ones that went to parliament to speak to the legislators on the laws that they wanted passed. We've also encouraged personal agency. We speak to holistic empowerment beyond the legal aid. We've partnered with other legal aid service providers to speak to health issues, speak to education, to speak to livelihoods, and also financial literacy for our clients. So we seek to give a holistic package to the clients that come to seek our services. We have lobbied for courts to be established in areas that have otherwise been considered remote in order for us to take services closer to the people. This has been through partnerships with the judiciary. We've also lobbied with the judiciary, the judicial officers in the districts in which we work to have them take mobile courts to the communities. And we have found these mobile courts to be very participatory in nature, and the communities are, in a way empowered by the whole process, and it demystifies the whole court environment and enables witnesses to give their evidence and so on. We've also lobbied for mobile, for family justice desks at strategic courts to help clients navigate the complex judicial processes and systems. We have also lobbied for specialized courts, GBV courts, and we are happy to note that the justice, law and order sector has since institutionalized this, and trial sessions are ongoing. And the key thing in these GBV courts is that they are survivor centered, that at least they allow room for the survivors to state their case without fearing re-victimization. We've also engaged communities through community legal volunteers, community justice actors, and influencers, as well as the traditional and cultural leaders as a first point of contacts in the communities. And we've also encouraged innovation to take services closer to the people. We have a legal aid application as well as FIDA Uganda. We are in the process of developing a legal aid kiosk with support from Hill Justice Innovations that we are looking to, dispensing the basic legal aid. If someone wants a will, if somebody wants a sale agreement, they can easily access it from this machine without necessarily having to interface with the legal officers. We've also formed human rights clubs as a preventive strategy to ensure the understanding of the young rights holders is matched with their responsibilities as they grow older. And we've also partnered with the district officials to co-opt some of their officers that are on their payrolls to join our community legal volunteer scheme. In this way, there is partnership and buy-in on the work that we are doing, but it also ensures sustainability beyond the project life after the project has come to an end. So as FIDA, we have found that the dual strategy of applying both the informal and informal justice systems are useful in increasing access to justice. And we have in our programming sought to diffuse reproduction of gender inequalities produced by the formal justice systems. We have thus developed gender cultural principles as a guide to the dispensation of justice for the cultural leaders. We have continuously trained them on the basic tenets of the law to again enable them to dispense justice in their communities. And we are proud to have successfully lobbied for the co-option of cultural leaders onto what we call district chain link committees. This has previously been a preserve of only the formal justice sector. So for them to agree in a particular district in which we work, to co-opt the cultural leaders is a huge success story for FIDA. And we are hoping that we can lobby other district officials for us to scale up this intervention. We've also been able to encourage women to join elders forums that were previously occupied by only men. And what we are trying to do is to engender the access to justice process at the informal sector level. We've continuously, because FIDA is a membership-based organization, engaged our members, trained them on the application of international instruments to promote gender-responsive jurisprudence. So briefly, of course, everybody has been saying how the COVID-19 has played out and how it has affected the work that they have been doing. Briefly for us as FIDA, definitely COVID-19 disproportionately affected the poor and vulnerable, majority of poor and vulnerable in our communities, majority of whom are women and children, who are obviously our clients. And as already mentioned, the pandemic amplified already existing gender inequalities and has threatened the gains that we've already been, proud to have been associated with. It has definitely put a dent in that progress. SGBV cases tripled. We've seen unprecedented levels of teenage pregnancies because of restrictions to, there was no schools that were open. People were attending school from their home environments. And this has already found, this found an already fragile and inadequate response mechanism. So it has put a strain on the service provision, both at state and even on us as service providers. Restricted movement definitely has had an increased effect on the transportation costs for the justice seekers. Bus fares have doubled. And also restrictions on public gatherings have definitely slowed down our program and community engagements. I have to mention that the economic distress and economic retrenchment has definitely doubled the numbers of women who are previously independent and are now dependent on their spouses to provide for them. So they are coming to seek for maintenance for their children. And we've also seen an increased failure of respondents to honor obligations, even when court processes have been successful. So lastly, while we rely on online platforms and online legal advice, the prohibitive taxes on data, the minimal data coverage across the country, and the general inability to access these platforms has further widened the gender digital divide. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Adrico. I think you have shown us that the justice gap is still wide for for women and girls. But you've also emphasized the importance, I think, of the community level involvement. We often talk about the global level, the regional, the national level, but that local level, the community level is just so important. And the work that you're doing with champions at different types at that level, I think is key. And what you mentioned about customary and informal justice, as you know, this is an important area of work for IDLO, and we have actually come out with a publication this year on customary and informal justice and women and girls, relating exactly to the issues that women and girls face when dealing with these type of systems. So thank you so much for that intervention. IDLO also works from the top down with governments to strengthen laws and institutions, helping to make them more effective, accessible, and accountable. We help to fight corruption and discrimination and to build judicial independence and legal capacity. And much of this work is carried out in conflict-affected, fragile contexts where the challenges are more pronounced, resources are scarce, and reforms may take years or be set back by recurring cycles of insecurity and violence. We're very pleased to have with us today the Honorable Mr. Gamal Mohammed Hassan, the Minister of Planning, Investment and Economic Development of Somalia. Mr. Minister, your ministry is responsible for planning and coordinating socioeconomic development and sustainable economic growth. What is the role of a well-functioning justice system in promoting sustainable development in the Somali context? And what are the challenges that Somalia has faced in building justice institutions that are effective, accountable, accessible, and responsive? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's with a great pleasure that I join you today in this auspicious panel. We are in a very trying times globally. The pandemic is causing huge economic and social upheavals across the world. Like all other parts of public life, the administration of justice and access to legal remedies and dispute resolution have been severely disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In our country, with limited resources, we have reflected our country plans to respond effectively to the needs of our people. Working together, we can harness once again the same energy, commitment, and tenacity that successfully propelled SDG 16 onto 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development 4 years ago. I was very happy to notice that most of the areas of importance to Somalia is reflected in the strategy. Issues regarding institutional building, access to justice, combating corruption, and climate justice are issues that we grapple with on a daily basis. The strategy lays out the organization's plan to advance access to justice, combat inequalities, and promote social inclusion for all. These are some of the core areas that we identified during our consultations when we developed the Somali National Development Plan. On institutions, building effective institutions, ensuring access to justice takes time, effort, and will. But the investment into this area by our development partners should not waver. The moral case is evident. The business case is even more compelling. In this climate, where the resources are becoming finite, it's important to revitalize partnerships to deliver to the needs of the people. A good example has been IDLO's partnership with UNDP in enhancing access to justice. And in the past few years, we have seen that collaborations in Somalia. The IDLO partnership with UNDP Somalia developed and took various forms since 2013 and resulted in IDLO being invited in 2018 to directly participate in the implementation of the Somalia Joint Justice Program, which is a multi-year program supporting the Somalia National Development Plan 2020-2024, particularly the second pillar, the security and rule of law pillar, which calls for secure and improved access to affordable justice and increasing public trust and confidence in the judiciary. IDLO is the only non-UN agency due to its intergovernmental organizational status and its mandate to promote the rule of law in Somalia. UNSOM, UNDP, UN Women, and UNICEF are the participating UN agencies, with UNDP being the lead agency. Key areas of focus of the Somalia Justice Program, which has been a very successful program, include One, the federalization of the justice sector and state building, including the constitutional review process and agreeing to a federated model for the judiciary. Two, strengthening justice institutions as part of the comprehensive approach to security and methods of countering violent extremism. Three, strengthening the leadership, planning, and management capacity of the justice sector institutions. This sector has faced severe deterioration during the civil war, so this actually component will strengthen the capacity of the judicial system in Somalia. Nationalizing training capacities and standardizing training programs for judges, prosecutors, registrars, and other judicial officials. Promoting oversight, accountability, and inclusivity for the judiciary. Expanding and strengthening justice services to new districts. Adopting community-oriented approach to improving local access to justice and ensure stabilization. Putting in place legal and policy frameworks that promote gender equality. These are some of the core issues that Somalia Joint Justice Program, with the IDLO is helping us in partnership with UNDP and other agencies, is doing in the country. It is really one of the core programs that are responding to our reform programs in the judiciary sector. On the strategic plan and implementation, we look forward to seeing these types of partnerships and collaborations to continue to enhance access to justice and deepen the rule of law in Somalia. Finally, the federal government of Somalia values greatly this relationship with IDLO and appreciates the organization's direction and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for joining us, and particularly for telling us that the issues that we deal with in our strategy are issues that you are grappling with on a daily basis, and that you do see value in the close cooperation that we have on the ground, in particular with UNDP, because this is an area that our Assembly of the Parties has been encouraging us to strengthen. So thank you so much. We look forward to continuing to work with you. So staying on the link between the rule of law and sustaining peace, let me turn now to Mr. Fernandez Taranco, the Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building Support, another wonderful colleague with deep experience to share. Oscar, despite some initial optimism around the SG's initial call for a global ceasefire, many conflicts around the world have continued unabated. Global trends, including climate change, competition over land, natural resources, economic inequality, and most recently, COVID-19, have had a significant impact on conflict dynamics. And the UN has placed an increased emphasis on preventing conflict by addressing its root causes. What is the importance of the rule of law in building and sustaining peace? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. It's really great to see you. And it's a very big honor actually to join this panel and to be part of the Assembly of Parties today for the launch of your new strategic plan. Really very, very pleased and happy to be part of this event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying that as we're discussing your strategic plan today here in New York, member states are in the process of negotiating a renewed resolution of the General Assembly and the Security Council precisely on the role of peace building and sustaining peace, and actually basing a lot of these deliberations on the Secretary General's recently launched report on peace building and sustaining peace. I would like to basically focus on three key issues in response to some of the questions you raised in this and in the previous sessions. First, is important to state that the UN peace building architecture and the mechanism is actually working. In the Secretary General's report that was just launched, we have been able to document how far we have come in realizing that original 2005 vision for peace building and implementing the twin resolutions that were passed in 2016 on sustaining peace. In that report, you have a lot of documentation on the results, practical results on the ground. It makes it very clear in the report that looking at the suffering around the world today, that the human and the financial cost on focusing primarily on crisis response is absolutely unsustainable. Which is why the Secretary General has been so intent in reorienting our work towards prevention and peace building, on rebalancing our approach to peace and security, and on further connecting the work across peace, sustainable development, and human rights. The second message is that partnerships are a central tenet of peace building and sustaining peace. The comprehensive approach that peace building requires and the scale and the nature of the challenge of sustaining peace calls for this close strategic and operational partnership among the United Nations, the governments, and other key stakeholders, including the international, regional, and sub-regional organizations, international financial institutions, the civil societies, the women's groups, youth organizations, and the important role of the private sector. In 2020, the COVID-19 actually, as many have already stated, has devastated communities and economies throughout the world, impacting especially the poorest and the most vulnerable. And so more than ever before, we require this multidimensional, coordinated response, a sort of a whole of society, people-centered approaches are required for this response to be meaningful and to build back better. The response to COVID-19 is not just about health and economy. It is about ensuring that the response does not exacerbate the existing grievances, which means, again, that the connection between humanitarian development, peace, and human rights is more critical than ever. And the third message here is that the rule of law is both an outcome and an enabler of peace and sustainable development. And this, I think, IDLO realizes in practice that it is a critical interlinkage, and it's extremely well embedded in your new strategic plan. We know that investments in women are consistently included in peace process, that are consistently included in the peace process and in political decision makers are investments in peace. And then this is likewise true for all the marginalized communities or those facing discrimination, including young people. But these are not just instrumental arguments. They are first and foremost arguments about human rights, about the right to participate, the right to voice, and to equality, and bridging societal divides and fostering inclusive, rights-based approaches are essential to building and sustaining peace. So such approaches require equitable access to social services, inclusive and just institutions, the rule of law and access to justice, the functioning of grievance mechanisms, and again, the sustained efforts to foster social cohesion, which is why, and I think the strategic plan makes a very strong case, we must rally around the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as a cornerstone for the long-term prevention to address drivers of fragility and root causes of conflict. So here, again, I'd like to salute the work, Jan, that you and the colleagues have been making in IDLO. It is not only the only global intergovernmental organization that is exclusively devoted to promoting the rule of law and sustainable development, but also working across more than 90 countries. And again, significantly for us, as part of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the important work of IDLO is that it works across this breadth of rule of law engagement, from work on customary and informal justice systems to climate justice, land rights, and food security. So let me say just a quick word about the parts of the peace building architecture that I'm most familiar with and that I interact with, and how this relates to the work of IDLO. The Peace Building Commission has grown over the past few years in its advisory, bridging, and convening roles in support to these nationally owned peace building priorities. It is enhancing this intergovernmental coherence. The annual ECOSOC PBC joint meeting that happened just last week with the president of ECOSOC, who just spoke, on the theme of fostering global solidarity and conflict-sensitive responses to COVID-19 pandemic, is a clear demonstration of this cross-pillar collaboration. Since its initial engagement in support to a democratic transition in the Gambia in March of 2017, the Commission, for example, which met just recently yesterday, has helped mobilize this international support for the government's peace-building priorities. The Secretary General's Peace-Building Fund has approved some $20 million in support of transitional justice, security sector reform, women and youth empowerment, and other peace-building priorities in the Gambia. The government of Burkina Faso has recently sought the Peacebuilding Commission's support in pursuit of its peacebuilding priorities, including specific actions in the area of rule of law. The Peacebuilding Commission, again, continues to provide the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, just 2 weeks ago, we were meeting on this precise aspect. And in the Central African Republic, the Commission has been providing advice to the Security Council on how, in the renewal of MINUSCA's mandate, the aspects and the criticality of support to the rule of law programs, including the transitional justice, represent a core component of the mission renewal activity. So it is also not surprising that the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund is frequently called upon to support the strengthening of the rule of law. And overall, I can say that in the area of rule of law and human rights related initiatives, we have just in the past 3 years approved over some $90 million. And we have seen since 2015 quite a significant increase in demand for this very important sector that you are so ably pushing forward. And as many of the speakers refer to, lack of funding for rule of law intervention, lack of funding for access to justice, which many of the previous speakers referred to, is one of the critical challenges identified also in the Secretary General's report as part of the critical challenges for peace building. In the case of the fund, we have been supporting access to justice mechanisms in the case of Guatemala, to actually building and strengthening the institutions and legal frameworks related to the adjudication of land conflicts, which has been the case in Somalia. And the Honorable Minister was just referring to some of the activities that the joint UN agencies are undertaking with financing provided by the Peacebuilding Fund. And finally, also the strengthening of human rights compliance and cross-border security cooperation in the Sahel. So just in conclusion, I think extremely important that we work hand in hand across the peace, development, human rights, and humanitarian work to ensure that we are focused on leaving no one behind, that we are reaching the furthest left behind, and that, again, this collective effort is key to building stronger and more resilient societies, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to congratulate you, Yen, and all your colleagues for the shining example of your work in this area. This is, I think, a historic opportunity to revisit and to see how your new strategic plan is actually extremely complementary to many of the initiatives that the Secretary General here is launching throughout his reform to ensure that our institutions are collaborating and working closer, much closer than they have been in the past. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for that very interesting intervention, and particularly for reminding us about the absolute importance of prevention, and of course the importance of working across the pillars, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. I very much appreciate what you said about the need for all of us to work much more closely together. I think that that is what we have tried to do through the strategic plan, to show a very close alignment with the initiatives of the Secretary General and of the General Assembly, of the international community generally, in terms of the link between peace and sustainable development, human rights, and the rule of law. Just one last word about financing. As you know, it's a major challenge. It was a challenge before. It's probably going to be a greater challenge in the future with COVID-19 and the impacts that it may have on ODA and diversion of funding from a sector that was never particularly well funded. But we are hoping that we will be able to look to new and innovative forms of financing, and we look forward also to hopefully having a closer relationship with you and the Peacebuilding Fund. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'm turning now to the last but not least member of our panel, Dr. Ghazal Khares, the Ombudsman for the Islamic Republic of Iran, a key role during this time of transition. And you have just joined us from the Geneva Conference on Afghanistan, a very important meeting. How do you see the prospects for stronger and more accountable institutions serving people-centered justice and promoting a more inclusive society in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Jan. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, and co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be part of this panel today and to talk to you about the impact of COVID on rule of law and institutions of justice, and particularly to share with you our experiences of fighting corruption during COVID pandemic in Afghanistan. But before that, let me thank IDLO for organizing this panel and having us share our experiences from different parts of the world, and also thank IDLO for their decades of support to Afghanistan, and particularly to the justice sector, and in particular their support to the justice sector, particularly at the time of COVID pandemic. This has been a great partnership, and we look forward to this partnership in the years to come. We are all aware that almost every country around the world, whether developed or developing, faced numerous challenges in 2020 due to the spread of COVID-19. As countries struggle to contain the coronavirus, they also have a parallel responsibility to address the socioeconomic implications of the crisis. The pandemic is certainly a public health crisis. However, it also poses serious risks to many other aspects of our daily lives, including rule of law, good governance, and delivery of justice. And we heard that from a number of our panelists from different parts of the world today as well. In developing societies, where building and maintaining rule of law is already a challenge, the implications of COVID-19 are more severe and may continue for much longer. The current crisis requires us to look to a broader range of pathways to respond to this crisis. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, reports of corruption and misuse of funds surged globally. The crisis created by COVID brought along a host of legal challenges, inspection, investigation, courts and other legal services across the world had to close or minimize their operations. Countries that already suffered from corruption had dual crises, both the pandemic and the corruption. Although it was not unexpected, we have experienced from the previous crisis of the same magnitude from around the world. But many countries failed to prepare and respond to both the crises simultaneously. While the extent of the corruption was different in different societies in different parts of the world, the common element was the immense damaging impact of corruption on citizens, particularly crisis coupled with corruption severely compromised response to the crisis, deprived people of healthcare, and resulted in the loss of lives. Corruption weakened people's trust in the government and its institutions at a time when the collective approaches to address the pandemic was much needed. Afghanistan has suffered for long from endemic corruption, despite nearly 2 decades of continuous efforts to combat corruption. It remains a persistent rule of law problem for the country. Corruption during pandemic impacted rule of law and created poor accountability mechanisms between the state and the citizens. And of course, Afghanistan was not an exception to that. Like any other country, COVID-19 gave rise to substantial risk of corruption in Afghanistan, as extensive resources were mobilized and allocated to fight the spread of pandemic and respond to undesirable economic impact. The pandemic not only required rapid decision-making in response, but also flexibility in application of the financial and procurement rules intended as safeguards against corruption. The government relaxed financial management and procurement rules to effectively respond to COVID, but it also introduced specific strategies to mitigate the risks of corruption and enforce integrity while demanding efficiency. Despite the measures, corruption did happen. Corrupt public officials not only deprived people of the services, but also deceived the government that had entrusted them with the duty to provide services to the people. As an indirect cost, corruption harms people's confidence in the effectiveness and legitimacy of state institutions. Corruption during COVID weakened the already fragile trust in public institutions in Afghanistan. However, the fact that cases of corruption and mismanagement of COVID funds were exposed and reported by media, civil society, and citizens is a sign that people demand accountability and transparency. I would like to stress that Afghan media were the real champions of fight against corruption during COVID by risking their lives and preparing investigative reports to flag cases of corruption. The government of Afghanistan welcomed the reports and assigned the Office of the Ombudsperson to conduct thorough inspection of the claims. Inspection of COVID-19 expenditure highlighted a number of serious vulnerabilities in Afghanistan's public institutions. Service delivery through the public health system and financial management, mainly at the subnational level, are some examples to discuss. Our findings show that the COVID outbreak was used as a golden opportunity by a number of public officials to make money. Our findings showed irregularities and lack of transparency in procurement, quite widespread and prevalent. Exclusion of civil society and local media representatives from the oversight committees, and price gouging of medical supplies, among others. Furthermore, the funds that were aimed at addressing the economic impact of the crisis were not immune from the corruption either. While state agencies struggle to distribute basic necessities to the destitute, corrupt officials use the opportunity for personal gain. The necessity to respond to the COVID crisis was brought up by most of the officials as the reason to undermine financial and procurement rules, particularly ratified to prevent corruption. We repeatedly heard during our inspections that it was not the time to pressurize the officials for accountability. However, we have stressed to all the institutions that urgency should not come at the cost of accountability. No circumstance should be used to deviate from transparency and accountability. It is always the time to ensure accountability and to combat corruption. Based on the findings of the Office of the Ombudsperson, a substantial number of officials, including some high-ranking officials, were introduced for prosecution. The Office of the Ombudsperson presented specific recommendations to the Ministry of Health and the local authorities, emphasizing on the lessons learned and the need for them to act with greater accountability. Ensure transparent procurement processes, do better needs assessments, and ensure purchasing of essential medical supplies only. To conclude, COVID crisis must not compromise standards of accountability and transparency. While the second wave of COVID-19 seems inevitable, it is critical to continue a strong stance against corrupt practices. Government pandemic response plans and policies must include measures for anti-corruption and integrity. Corruption had implications in our response to pandemic in the first wave. Therefore, the lessons learned from the first wave must be applied to ensure efficient response without compromising anti-corruption procedures and systems of accountability. I thank you all and look forward for a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Harris. We have had in IDLO a very long and very fruitful partnership with Afghanistan and with yourself, and I would like to thank you particularly for your personal leadership on these issues of the rule of law and access to justice. We very much appreciate your efforts and the efforts of the Office of the Ombudsperson, and I think you have showed us that there are many pathways when moving towards strengthened rule of law and access to justice, and the work that is being done on anti-corruption and gender equality and strengthening accountability is all part of it. And we look forward to continuing to partner with you. I'm now going to open the floor to the audience to pose some questions to the panelists. If you would like to ask a question, please let us know via the chat feature, and I'll see how many will be able to give an opportunity to make an intervention. I have received a request from the Minister Plenipotentiary in Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Alfredo Mangione, who is the co-chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. And I'd very much like to give him the floor. This is a group with which IDLO is looking forward to collaborate. You have the floor, sir. Is he coming?
Thank you, Director General. distinguished panelists, excellencies. First of all, congratulations on the launch of IDLO Next Strategic Plan. On behalf of the incoming Italian presidency of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, I'm glad to inform you that we will lead the work of this working group with a clearly set agenda and deliverables according to selected priorities in the perspective of building legally shaped economic environments in a multi-level legal system. The rule of law, a core mandate of the IDLO, is a lighthouse for the activities of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group towards implementation of Goal 16. Our priorities will be articulated around how better understand the new forms and new avenues of corruption in the globalized economy, considering and assessing links with the economic crimes and organized crime, as well as focusing emerging risk areas like sport. And relatedly, how to improve indicators to measure corruption through evidence-based and more reliable indicators that may help anchor corruption measurement in the rule of law. Next year, we will also negotiate and agree on the new action plan for the next 3 years. Rule of law is a cornerstone of the global fight against corruption. And this is underlined also in the draft political declaration of the next UN General Assembly special session on corruption. The rule of law is always important, but becomes crucial in times of crisis when anti-corruption and the rule of law become a critical component of recovering better. Therefore, it is our pleasure to invite IDLO inter alia along with other international organizations to join our annual meetings of the Anti-Corruption Working Group next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mangoni. I'm going to take 2 or 3 more questions, and then I will go back to the panel for any comments they would like to make on any of the issues that are raised or questions that are asked. The next speaker I have is Mr. Nussbaumer, the Director for Legal Transition in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. You have the floor.
Sorry, okay. Did you hear anything or?
Not yet. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Director General. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to raise a question regarding commercial and economic legislation. We all know that supporting economic activity and investment is crucial to development, and this is an area where the EBRD and IDLO have worked together. So the question to our panelists is, what should be the priorities in reforming commercial and economic legislation in the post-pandemic period? Usually, when there is a crisis, the focus is always on insolvency laws and laws on financial restructurings, anything that can facilitate the survival of companies. But this crisis, in a way, is different. This COVID crisis, it has so much changed the way we live. So maybe there should be more priorities or different priorities to reform economic and commercial legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Maaike de Langen, Head of Research for the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this this session, and I was truly impressed by all the speakers. Congratulations to IDLO on their strategic plan. From the Pathfinders perspective, we were, of course, very happy to see that people-centered justice is now one of the core values of IDLO's work, and I would encourage all the participants to look at the Hague Declaration that sets out the principles of people-centered justice, as well as the Justice for All report that provides the bigger narrative, and that Hague Declaration has been endorsed by 40 countries and counting. So I think we are on a good track there. The other second quick remark I would like to make is on the importance of justice data. This was raised by a number of speakers, and I think that is really critical as we move forward in the justice sector and in our justice work to really focus on how we can measure people's justice problems and experiences throughout their justice journeys. And I think we've been helped greatly by the acceptance of the new indicator for measuring access to civil justice 16.3.3 for those who like the details of the indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. And Pathfinders will be working with the co-custodians and many of our other partners, including national statistics offices, to really push forward and get that justice data ready so that it can inform policy and strategies. And we look forward to working with IDLO's country programs in that respect as well. Now, a quick question I would have for the panelists, and they've given so many reflections already, especially on how this whole notion of the current crisis has made the agenda, the SDG agenda, truly universal and a topic we can all collaborate on. The Task Force on Justice has recommended that justice actors focus on people's most common justice problems and trying to resolve those, improving their justice journeys and creating fair outcomes. So how can this approach be better integrated in national justice strategies and international support programs? I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll just take one more speaker because of the time, and that will be Thomas Seltzer, who is the Dean of the International Anti-Corruption Academy. You have the floor. So now to the panel, and we had a number of questions there about new forms of corruption, about indicators to measure corruption, about priority in reforming economic legislation in the pandemic period, about the importance of focusing on the most pressing justice needs of citizens. So I turn back to the panel, and maybe I would like to start with Minister Davletov.
Thank you very much. The question on reforming the commercial law is very important for Uzbekistan. I just wanted to make some points on that because during the pandemic, we saw that the legislation lacks flexibility, and especially the group is working on improving contractual relations, given the new challenges and to embody new relations, especially electronic means of having contractual obligations. This is a new sphere for Uzbekistan because internet is developing, it's getting cheaper. The business is feeling that it's high time to go online. So of course, this is bringing new issues, new challenges to legislation as well. Again, what we're doing is to codifying the commercial legislation, because as I told, we have influx of regulations on business matters, business regulations, hundreds of bylaws. So the special group is working on now codifying and making one single piece of legislation on business activities. It's entrepreneurship code. So this is a really big issue that we're considering at the moment. And the stock market is on the rise in Uzbekistan. We have new managers, new leaders for the agency for stock market. they are bringing new values to the market, so that there's a confidence in our market, and people will use and invest their money, because a great deal of investment is coming from outside, and especially the people who work outside, you know, the migrants, billions of dollars pouring into the Uzbek economy. And because of the confidence, sometimes they're not willing to invest. So stock market is something that we're working on at this moment. And again, litigation, because of the really big court caseload, and the ADR is something that the sphere that is really priority, and the Minister of Justice is responsible. And we passed a new legislation to make it easier to register new ADR schemes and institutions, and the government is supporting, and the Minister of Justice itself is opening the mediation centers as well. So in short, these are the main parts where we're working on commercial law at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Akim Steiner to our discussion, and we are just concluding the panel discussion. So I'm just going to give the other panelists maybe 2 minutes each to give a closing thought in response to what they have heard. So Minister Hassan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Like my colleague said, this is a very fruitful discussion. We congratulate IDLO for the strategic plan. We're looking forward to working with you very closely. As I mentioned earlier, IDLO is a highly valued partner in Somali government, and we appreciate the way they work with other UN agencies, the collaboration between them and UNDP and others in the justice sector. We look forward to seeing more of these collaborations with other agencies on the ground. Going forward, we hope to further strengthen the relationship with IDLO and others as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Minister. I'm turning to Ombudsman Ghazal Hares.
Thank you very much, Jan. I would just like to likewise thank all the panelists. It was a very informative panel and discussion. Very interesting to hear experiences from around the world. And I would like to emphasize that during the pandemic, at the time of health crisis, it is important that we still ensure integrity and ensure that our anti-corruption policies and procedures are in place, and not allow a state of emergency, a situation like COVID crisis, to become an excuse for corrupt practices. I thank you all, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for your personal leadership. And finally, Oscar, some final thoughts.
Thank you, Jan. I know we're running short of time, but just to again congratulate you for the framing of the strategic plan, and basically refer to your 3 key enablers, which I think are very much at the heart of the discussion today. The importance of inclusion in the decision-making process, the importance of multidimensional integrated responses, and the leveraging of collecting data. Am I not being heard? Sorry, yes, okay, and so, and just to conclude, extremely important in this notion that you refer to as sort of the top-down and the bottom-up, the importance of institution building, increasing the accountability, the transparency, of the institutions that we're building precisely to address these issues of access to justice and fighting corruption, etc. And the bottom-up approach, which is this people-centered, inclusive spaces where people participate in defining how they see their problems to access to justice, to security, to development, etc. And so this combines, I think, a joint effort of building institutions of the state, building the trust, building the legitimacy, building on the many SDGs, and particularly SDG 16 that you were referring to, but also putting people at the center of this equation, particularly women and young people, SDG 5, and investing in that, investing in those community-led initiatives, while at the same time investing in the structures of the state to deliver those services, essential services for peace, development, and human rights. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been a big pleasure to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, Lillian Enrico from Uganda. Over to you.
Just to say thank you for convening us to IDLO. I think it was a very useful platform, a very important space for us to share experiences. Thank you very much. And again, we were honored to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We look forward to continue partnering with you. And I'm now delighted to welcome Mr. Achim Steiner to deliver some closing remarks. For 3 decades, Achim has been a global leader in sustainable development, climate resilience, and international cooperation. And in his many roles, including leading the United Nations Environment Programme, as director of the Oxford Martin School, and now as administrator of UNDP, he has been a champion of the rule of law and a voice for the vulnerable, and a wonderful colleague, I might say. So IDLO is very proud to strengthen its partnership with UNDP under his leadership. Over to you, Achim.
And thank you so much both for your kind words of introduction, joining you very much as a friend, but also as somebody who has had the privilege of working alongside and with IDLO in previous capacities, and certainly continue to do so as head of the United Nations Development Programme today. And particularly pleased to join you on this occasion, because with your new strategic plan, Jan, you and all those who count themselves in the constituency of the idea of IDLO, I think see both the urgency and the perspective with which the rule of law and justice and access to justice, people's access to justice, is by no means something that we should take either for granted or even that we're always progressing. And I think this is perhaps my departure point. But before I do so, let me also offer my congratulations to Pakistan. I understand that you have just been elected as president. My heartfelt congratulations, and to all the others who will join you, Jan, in leading and guiding IDLO in the implementation of this strategic plan. And the election comes, the new strategic plan comes at a moment where, as I'm sure my fellow panelists have already alluded to, we are confronted with everything but a hopeful outlook in the sense of just progression. We are witnessing in our global family of nations and communities not only COVID-19 with all its multidimensional implications, health, social, economic, but also in the domain of governance and the rule of law and fundamental rights. And I think it's not necessarily a reality that is always, deliberately trying to constrain people's access to justice. We see in many societies right now the incredible challenge and the dilemma of trying to manage a world in which a virus has gone wild and continues to threaten us all and continues to progress at the moment at growing speed. And while a vaccine remains that less and less elusive and hopefully more real moment in time where we can contain this pandemic, the world really is affected at this moment in ways that I think hasn't yet changed as we all anticipate the future, but it certainly has had this, and I'm sure others have spoken, is the revelation effect. And clearly, Jan, you and I met before you took up your position and subsequently, and we spoke about the reality that in many of our societies, the rule of law and people's access to justice, rights-based approaches to development, the fundamental enshrinement of human rights in not just the constitutional dimension of law, but in the practice and in the reality of justice systems, is something that we continue to be concerned about. Because on the one hand, there are still too many for whom access to justice remains a hypothetical possibility. It might have to do with your economic status, with poverty, It might have to do with restrictions that you face. And I think one of the things that I appreciate very much in your strategic plan, and also in our Justice Partners configuration, where we, together with UNODC, Pathfinders, and others, work together, is that we recognize that in many countries, it's not just a return to something, it is the further evolution of the understanding of justice, of law, the rule of law, and that is the most meaningful part of realizing the rule of law, access to it. And in the way that I think we are experiencing right now, the dilemmas that societies face when it comes to lockdowns, the assertion of state power vis-a-vis citizens in the name of the common interest of citizens is certainly manifesting itself in many, many different ways. I speak to you this morning from Brooklyn, New York, United States of America. It's one end of the spectrum of the divided approach to this pandemic, and it goes right to the core of justice, legal systems, challenges, federalism, and the subsidiary powers of states and local authorities. So here is one dimension, first of all, in which the pandemic, I think, has reminded us that access to justice and the rule of law is a multi-tiered system in which we must recognize that, yes, there are constitutional rights, but then there are many laws and regulations and authorities bestowed upon different levels of government that can either create more cohesion and guarantee access to justice or can actually undermine it. And I think this goes to the core of one of the areas in which UNDP works, which is to help countries look at governance and the rule of law and how to ensure that the ability of the state to act on behalf of its citizens is aligned with the fundamental rights of its citizens. I think a second part that we have seen emerge from here is also access to justice from an equity point of view. The terrible reality is that we are currently conducting debates in our society, sometimes more openly, sometimes less openly, whether the life of an older person is somehow more or less worthy than that of a younger person, and the association between economy and safety and security. These are, ethical dilemmas which do not always find an easy answer in the codification of law and justice and the practice of our justice systems. A third area that has been very much at the forefront also of UNDP's work in the last months is simply to maintain the functionality, the business continuity of justice systems. You and I have spoken about this, from the basic provision of Zoom licenses for a court to be able to continue to actually convene and fulfill its role, to trying to maintain a building of capacity and the institutional ability of a justice system to operate in the midst of a COVID freefall that we're experiencing right now. I mention all of these because I think they are both significant in terms of the moment, but they also speak to the so-called underlying conditions that have become such a favorite term that we use so often. I think when it comes to access to justice, to the rule of law, and to the broader governance domain, the underlying conditions are very significant, which in part explain also why we have seen not only states trying to deal with the virus, but also a pushback in terms of a fundamental rights agenda. I think constraining citizens in many parts of the world in exercising their right to access to justice, and therefore something that is of concern to the social contract between societies and their state institutions, and something that I think we have to address proactively. Out of COVID-19, I believe, and this is back to your strategic plan now and our commitment from within the UN family. I see my colleague Oscar is also part of the panel this morning. I think a very strong sense that we have much work to do together. It is work that I think is wanted by countries themselves, also by governments, because they sense a certain erosion in public trust and confidence, which is never a comfortable long-term perspective with which to be a government, to exercise state authority. And so my commitment this morning is simply to join you to renew, first of all, our strong interest in working with IDLO, with the constituencies that you bring together on the issues that you have identified in the strategic plan, and to make it very clear that in UNDP, as we look at the future of development, we very much consider governance to be a centerpiece around which much of what then manifests itself, whether in fundamental issues of the rule of law or in shaping the new digital reality that is also beginning to transform our societies. And as the Secretary General's high-level panel noticed when it looked at digital cooperation, why is it that so many of the fundamental rights that we have fought so hard for and codified in the analog era suddenly seem to exist in the digital era? This is nonsensical, it's regression, and it just points to the fact that I alluded to right at the beginning of my remarks. The rule of law is also something that must evolve. It must be contemporary. It must be developed with a perspective of the future that lies ahead of us. With that, again, Jan, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. It's been a privilege to help you send the strategic plan off in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakeem, for those very thoughtful remarks. And I take right from the beginning what you said, that when we look at the rule of law and access to justice, we cannot take it for granted. And I think that that has probably always been true, but it's become into even brighter relief, if you like, because of the COVID crisis. And particularly this issue of equity and the effect upon vulnerable groups and those who are definitely being left behind is something that I know that you in UNDP are very much have in the front of your minds, and we do too in IDLO. I think the ethical dilemmas that you spoke about are only going to increase. I'm noticing, for example, in some of the work that we're doing, which I think is very important at this time, on digital innovations in the justice sector, all the e-justice tools that are making justice in many countries more accessible and more transparent, faster. It's all very, very positive. But on the other hand, we still have that digital divide, and we still have a lot of people who are unable to access that justice, even in the new world. So the linkages that we've been making throughout this discussion, and that we make, I think, very strongly in our strategic plan between human rights, sustainable development, sustaining peace, and the rule of law are absolutely essential. So I'd really like to close now by thanking, first of all, our speakers today, Dr. Tedros, Deputy Director General Tesla, Minister Davletov, Chief Executive Officer Adrico, Minister Hassan, Assistant Secretary General Fernandez Taranco, and Dr. Jerez. And just before closing, I would like to give the floor to a great advocate for IDLO, Ms. Jenny Hahai, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the United States Mission to the United Nations in Rome, and the outgoing President of IDLO's Assembly of Parties. We'd like to thank you, Jenny, for all of your support to IDLO. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Director General Beagle. As outgoing President of the Assembly of Parties, I would love to congratulate IDLO on today's high-level thematic discussion. This discussion today further underscored the urgent need to ensure due consideration of the rule of law in all aspects of our collective work. On behalf of the 37 member parties of IDLO, I want to offer a heartfelt thank you to all of today's panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to participate in today's discussion. For better or for worse, we are all too familiar with the need to fashion a collective response to these complex global challenges. Most of our work here in Rome, well before COVID-19, has been wholly focused on lifting up the world's most vulnerable populations. Let's acknowledge some of the progress we've made. Whereas 72% of the world's population lived below the poverty line in 1950, for example, through innovation and increased agricultural productivity, that figure now stands at less than 10%. Of course, we strive to eliminate poverty and hunger altogether, and COVID-19 is currently threatening all of our ambitious timelines. In this light, the United States warmly welcomes IDLO's appropriately ambitious strategic plan for 2021 to 2024. We have a lot of work to do. The plan highlights that even before COVID-19, roughly 2/3 of humanity lacked the ability to meaningfully access justice. The plan also accurately links widespread frustration stemming from government's inability to meaningfully address corruption, which has been referenced many times during today's discussion, and inequality with intensifying armed conflicts and humanitarian crises throughout the world. But here's the good news. The plan also references the growing recognition of the importance of rule of law and access to justice in sustaining peace and development. And here's where IDLO comes in. As was repeatedly underlined both during this morning's meeting of the IDLO Assembly of Parties, as well as during this afternoon's panel discussion, IDLO is uniquely positioned to design and implement rule of law programs for each host country's unique situation. IDLO is a trusted and apolitical partner. I encourage all of you to ask a beneficiary about IDLO's work to raise awareness about gender-based violence and/or to build local capacity to prosecute crimes involving human trafficking. I am confident that you would hear that IDLO's people-centered, country-owned approach leads to concrete results, and that host countries intend to continue their partnership with IDLO or that work on their own. In conclusion, we firmly believe that today's strategic plan unveiled today strikes the right balance of addressing today's crises while anticipating those of tomorrow. IDLO's overwhelming focus will remain on strategic goal number 1, making justice systems more effective and responsive to people's needs. That's fundamental. At the same time, IDLO will pursue opportunities to gradually increase its programming on a second strategic goal, which is that rule of law drives peace and sustainable development. As our ambassador Kip Tom earlier stressed today, we're excited to see what IDLO can accomplish in the years ahead. Speaking personally, I'd like to heartily congratulate our esteemed colleague, the Ambassador of Pakistan, who will take over from me as the President of the Assembly of Parties. We look forward to working with Director General Beagle, with Ambassador Salim, and with all of you to help IDLO continue its mission and succeed in the years to come. Many, many thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your great support to IDLO, and particularly during this very challenging year where we have had to do the consultative process on our strategic plan and develop it. And many of you on this panel and today in the audience have contributed to that consultative process, and I hope you will see yourselves reflected in our plan. I want to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us today for this discussion and for the launch of our plan. Today's discussion shows that the rule of law serves not only as a guarantor of individual rights, but as a vital means to foster the trust of people in governments, to prevent conflict and fragility, to build and maintain peace, and to enable countries to unlock their development potential. But to be meaningful, it must have an impact on people's lives. It must protect people fleeing conflict, support the essential worker who has contracted the virus and can no longer feed his family, provide shelter to the woman locked into her home with an abusive partner, and offer a remedy to those displaced by a wildfire, hurricane, drought, or famine. The 2030 Agenda, enabled by the rule of law, can promote renewed multilateralism and provide a framework for the international community to collaborate on shared challenges, build resilience to common threats, and chart a course for a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. Our new strategy seeks to leverage IDLO's programs, research, policy, and advocacy with the goal of promoting people-centered justice and the rule of law's contribution to peace and sustainable development in line with our mandate and comparative advantages. Building a culture of justice requires time, effort, and sustained commitment. It is the best investment we can make in our collective future. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to continuing to partnering with you. Bye-bye.